The moment Clement Bishop rode into Beaumont, Texas, with $50 jingling in his saddlebag, and a name scrawled on a piece of paper, Hazel Abbott, he told himself it was just another job, and he almost believed it. It was the spring of 1878, and the Texas Panhandle was blooming reluctant and wild after a hard winter, the kind that froze cattle on their feet and left ranchers weeping into their empty hands. Clement had spent that winter drifting between cattle drives and odd work, the sort of man who kept his boots polished even when everything else about him had gone rough and worn. He was 28 years old, broad across the shoulders, with dark brown hair that curled just slightly at his collar and eyes the color of storm-washed sky. He wasn't a lawman, and he was proud of that distinction. He was a tracker, or so he called himself when people asked. He found things. Occasionally people. The man who had hired him was named Gerald Price, and Clement had not liked him from the first handshake. Price was the kind of man who wore his wealth the way some men wore cologne, too much of it, and all wrong. He had a cattle operation outside of Wichita Falls, a fine house with a wraparound porch that his money built but his character didn't deserve, and he had himself a missing fiancée. He'd laid the situation out flat on the table of his parlor with a decanter of Kentucky bourbon and a thin, practiced smile. "Her name is Hazel Abbott," Price had said, swirling his glass. "We are betrothed. She took it upon herself to leave before the wedding. A case of cold feet, I'm sure. She's a woman of delicate temperament." Clement had taken the bourbon because it was good and asked the questions he always asked. How long had she been gone? Which direction? Did she have money of her own? Price had answered each one with the patience of a man describing a stray horse rather than a woman, and somewhere in that patience was something that prickled at the back of Clement's neck like a burr under a saddle blanket. But $50 was $50, and he'd taken the job. That was 6 days ago. Now he was in Beaumont, which was a solid 200 miles southeast of Wichita Falls, which meant Hazel Abbott had not simply wandered. She had run with intention and direction, and she had made good time doing it. Clement respected that even before he'd laid eyes on her. He rode down the main street of Beaumont in the late afternoon light, the sky going amber and rose above the flat-roof storefronts. Beaumont in 1878 was a small but working town, growing off the lumber trade, with a rail spur that brought in goods and carried out timber. It smelled of sawdust and horse and the faint sweetness of the river that ran along its eastern edge. There was a general store, a livery, a hotel called the Magnolia that had seen better decades, and a saloon called the Two-Bit that had not. He tracked Hazel here through a combination of stagecoach records and the particular gift that long years of trailing had given him, the ability to notice what other men looked past. A woman traveling alone in 1878 was not invisible, but she was practiced at making herself seem so. He'd followed the ghost of her, a dark bonnet left behind at a way station near Nacogdoches, a boarding house in Lufkin where a woman matching her description had stayed one night and paid in coin and left before dawn, a store receipt in her name from a dry goods shop in Woodville. She was smart and careful and moving steadily southeast, and he had followed her the way a man follows a creek patient, reading the terrain, never rushing. He stabled his horse at the livery, a good-natured roan he called Biscuit for the color of him, and tipped his hat to the boy who took the reins. He carried his saddlebag into the Magnolia, got himself a room on the second floor, and washed the road off his face in the basin before going back downstairs. He had a plan which was simple: find her, talk to her, bring her back to Price, collect his $50, move on. He found her in the dining room of the Magnolia Hotel at 6 o'clock in the evening, and the plan did not survive the finding. She was seated at a corner table with a ledger book open before her, and a cup of coffee going cold at her elbow. She was perhaps 23 or 24, with hair the warm color of autumn oak leaves, pinned up with the kind of efficiency that had given up on vanity without surrendering entirely to it. She wore a dress of dark green cotton that was clean but travel-worn, and she held a pencil in her right hand that she tapped against the page with a particular rhythm that suggested deep thought rather than impatience. Her face was striking rather than pretty in the conventional way. There was a sharpness to her jaw, a directness in her brown eyes, a set to her mouth that spoke of a woman who had made a decision and was living inside it. What struck Clement first was not her appearance but the quality of her stillness. She was completely absorbed in whatever she was working on, and there was something in that absorption that was the opposite of hiding. She looked like a woman who was building something, not running from something. Or rather, she looked like a woman who had done her running and arrived somewhere and gotten to work. He took a table across the room and ordered a plate of beans and cornbread and a coffee, and watched her with the unobtrusive attention of long practice. She was going over numbers in that ledger with the focused care of someone learning a new trade. Occasionally she would look up and frown at the middle distance, working something out, and then return to the page. Once a woman who appeared to be the hotel proprietress stopped at her table and they exchanged a few quiet words, and Hazel smiled a real smile, not the performed kind, and the proprietress moved on looking satisfied. Clement ate his beans and thought about the $50, and thought about Gerald Price's thin smile, and thought about the particular way Price had said the words delicate temperament, and the 6 days of careful, deliberate southeastward travel that did not match that description at all. He sat with his coffee after the plate was cleared and watched her close the ledger and tuck her pencil into her hair above her ear with the absent-mindedness of a woman who had done it 1,000 times, and something in his chest did a thing it had not done in quite some time, something quiet and inconvenient. He left the dining room without speaking to her. He went upstairs and sat on the edge of the hotel bed in the lamplight and took the $50 silver out of his saddlebag and laid them on the coverlet and looked at them for a long time. Then he thought about what he had actually seen in 6 days of trailing Hazel Abbott. He thought about the boarding house keeper in Lufkin who had told him, with the particular wariness of a woman protecting another woman, that his quarry was a decent person who'd been through something she didn't deserve. He thought about the dry goods receipt that listed not only provisions but a blank journal, a bottle of ink, and a writing pen, not the purchases of a woman in a panic, but of a woman making plans. He thought about the 200 miles and the intention behind them, and he thought about Gerald Price saying she was his fiancée, and something about the way he said it, like the word fiancé meant the same thing as property. Clement Bishop had done a lot of things in his 28 years that he was not particularly proud of, but he had never in his life done a thing he was actively ashamed of. He held that distinction carefully, the way you hold something fragile when your hands are rough. He thought about whether returning Hazel Abbott to Gerald Price would be a thing he was actively ashamed of. He picked the coins up off the coverlet and put them back in the bag and tied the bag shut and made a decision. In the morning, he would return the money. But morning was still hours away, and he lay awake in the narrow hotel bed listening to the sounds of Beaumont at night. A dog barking somewhere, the distant piano from the two-bit saloon, the creak of the hotel settling around him, and thought about a woman with a pencil tucked in her hair and numbers in a ledger, building something out of nothing in a corner of a hotel dining room, and he felt something stir in him that was more dangerous than any job he'd ever taken. He was up before dawn and at the livery before the boy who worked there had finished his breakfast. He saddled Biscuit himself and tied his saddlebag across the back and rode out of Beaumont heading northwest. He rode for 4 hours until he found a town with a post office, which was the small settlement of Quincy, and there he wrote out a brief letter to Gerald Price of Wichita Falls and wrapped it around $50 silver in a postal envelope and handed it to the postmaster with enough coin to see it delivered. The letter said, "I located the subject of our arrangement and have determined I am unable to complete the work as specified. I return your payment in full. Do not contact me again regarding this matter. C. Bishop." He rode the 4 hours back to Beaumont feeling lighter than he had in years, which was inconvenient, because he was fully aware that returning $50 to a man who hadn't earned a refund was the act of a fool, and returning to the town where the woman was, rather than simply riding on to the next job, was the act of a man who had lost his practical mind entirely. He was back in Beaumont by early afternoon. He stabled Biscuit again, paid the boy, and went to the Magnolia dining room for a late lunch. Hazel Abbott was not there. He ate his lunch salt pork and potatoes, less inspiring than the previous night's beans, and asked the proprietress, a stout and capable woman named Mrs. Eliza Drummond, whether the woman with the ledger book was still staying at the hotel. Mrs. Drummond looked at him with the calibrated suspicion of a woman who ran a business in a frontier town and had developed a refined sense for trouble. "Why do you ask?" she said. "I have no ill intention toward her," Clement said, and he meant it plainly and without decoration. "I had a job that involved finding her. I've given up the job. I'm not going to trouble her. I'd just like to know she's all right, Mrs." Drummond studied him for a moment with eyes that had seen a great many men make a great many claims. "She's working," the proprietress said finally. "She's taken a position helping Mr. Hale at the feed and grain bookkeeping. She started this morning." Clement nodded. "Thank you." He did not go to the feed and grain. He went to the Two-Bit Saloon instead, not for the whiskey, though he had a small one, but because he needed to think without the temptation of going to find her. He sat at a corner table and nursed his drink and told himself several practical and sensible things. The money was sent. The job was undone, rather. He was a free man with no obligations in Beaumont, Texas, and no reason to stay. He should find the next job and ride toward it. He ordered a second whiskey and did not drink it and went back to the hotel. The next morning, he walked past the feed and grain on his way to get breakfast at a small establishment down the street from the Magnolia, because the Magnolia's kitchen, while adequate, had a tendency toward stale cornbread, and there was a woman down the street who made biscuits with a talent that bordered on the divine. The feed and grain had large windows at the front, and as Clement walked by, he could see through the glass the dim interior of the shop, sacks of grain stacked high, coils of rope, the dark wood of the service counter. Behind the counter, partially visible through the window, was a young woman writing in a ledger book, and even from the street he recognized the set of her shoulders and the pencil tucked in her hair. He kept walking. He got his breakfast and ate it slowly and came back up the street, and as he drew level with the feed and grain again, the door opened and Hazel Abbott walked out carrying a small crate of empty glass jars, and they nearly collided. He caught the crate before it could tip. "Beg your pardon," he said, steadying the crate between them. She looked up at him. She was perhaps half a foot shorter than him, with the alert, assessing eyes of a woman who had learned not to waste time being startled when she could be evaluating instead. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't see you there." "My fault entirely," he said, and because she was looking at him steadily and he had learned that lies told to direct gazes had a way of curdling things from the start, he said, "I'm Clement Bishop. I'm staying at the Magnolia." "Hazel Abbott," she said, which told him she wasn't hiding. She had chosen to stay in Beaumont under her own name, which was either brave or practical or both. "Are you passing through?" "I'm not sure," he said honestly. She tilted her head fractionally. "That's an unusual answer." "I usually know where I'm going," he said. "I'm working it out." There was a pause, comfortable enough that he noticed it, and then she said, "These jars need to go around back," and nodded at the crate. "I'll carry them," he said. She didn't argue, which he found he appreciated. Some people would have argued on principle, would have made a performance of independence. She simply walked and let him follow with the crate around the side of the building to a small yard where a wooden shelf ran along the back wall, and he set the crate down on the shelf and she arranged the jars with quick, efficient hands. "You're new to Beaumont," she said, not looking at him. "Arrived 2 days ago." "Tracker," she said, and it wasn't a question. He went still for a moment. "What makes you say that?" She glanced at him then, and there was something in her expression that was not quite amusement but lived in that neighborhood. "The way you walk. You were moving slow on the street just now. Watching. Most men passing through either walk fast because they're going somewhere or slow because they're drunk. You were walking slow and sober and paying attention to everything." She turned back to the jars. "I've been watching for trackers for 3 weeks. I know what they look like." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was hired to find you." She stopped arranging jars. Her hands went still on the shelf. "Gerald Price hired me," he said. "6 days ago I tracked you here." He paused. "Yesterday morning, I rode to Quincy and posted his money back to him with a letter saying I couldn't complete the job. Then I rode back." She turned around slowly and looked at him fully for the first time, and he saw something move in her face, not relief exactly, something more complicated than that. Something cautious and unwilling to be fooled. "Why?" she said. It was a fair and necessary question, and he gave it the honest answer it deserved. "Because I looked at you, and I looked at what I knew about how you'd traveled and where you'd ended up, and I thought about the man who hired me, and I made a judgment." "What judgment?" "That returning you to Gerald Price would be the first thing I'd done in my life that I was actually ashamed of." She was very quiet. Behind the building, the town went about its morning. A wagon rolling on the main street, someone calling out to someone else, a rooster making his belated announcement. Hazel Abbott stood with her back to the shelf of empty glass jars and looked at Clement Bishop with eyes that were doing a great deal of quiet, thorough work. "He told you I had cold feet," she said. Those were his words. "He hit me," she said simply, without drama or particular emphasis, the way a person states a thing they have finished being ashamed of. "Twice, in the 3 months we were betrothed. The second time left a bruise on my jaw that I told people was from a horse. I left the night I healed up enough to travel." Clement absorbed this with the stillness of a man who had suspected something of the kind and who felt it land heavy anyway. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't need you to be sorry," she said, not harshly. "I need you to be honest with me. Is there anything else I should know? Is there anyone else he might send?" "He might," Clement said. "I'd be lying if I said he wouldn't. He's the kind of man who considers what he paid for his. He'll want his money back, or he'll want to be satisfied some other way." She nodded slowly, thinking, and he saw her work through it, the reality of her situation, the limited options, the weight of continuing to be careful. "I have a job here," she said. "I have $17 saved. I'm good with numbers, and Mr. Hale has been fair. I was planning to stay through the summer and see about something more permanent in the fall." She paused. "I was trying to make something that was mine." "That's worth protecting," Clement said. She looked at him. "Why are you still here?" she asked. "You sent the money back. You've told me what you know. You could ride out and that would be the end of it." He considered several answers and chose the truest one. "I'm not certain you're safe," he said, "and I find I mind about that more than I expected to." A beat of silence. "You found me in 3 weeks," she said. "A better tracker could find me in 2. That's possible. So staying in Beaumont isn't necessarily safer just because you've stepped back." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." They looked at each other, and something passed between them, a mutual acknowledgement that the situation was real and required thinking through, and possibly also something that had nothing to do with the situation at all, something that lived beneath the practical and looked up at inconvenient moments. "I should go back inside," she said. "Mr. Hale will wonder." "Of course." She started for the back door of the feed and grain and then stopped with her hand on the door frame and looked back at him over her shoulder. "The Magnolia dining room," she said. "Dinner is at 6. "I know," he said. She went inside. Clement Bishop stood in the yard behind the feed and grain of Beaumont, Texas in the spring of 1878 with a chest full of something he couldn't name precisely but which felt, against all practical sense, remarkably like hope. He spent the rest of the day doing useful things. He made inquiries at the sheriff's office. Beaumont's sheriff was a weathered man named Amos Cole who had a gray mustache and the patient eyes of a man who had seen enough to stop being surprised by most of it. Clement explained that he'd been hired as a tracker by a man in Wichita Falls and had declined the job, but was concerned the man might send someone else. He gave Price's name without hesitation. Sheriff Cole listened and made no promises but wrote the name in his book, which was something. He also visited the livery and had a conversation with a man named Terence Bovise who ran the stable, a broad-shouldered man of Creole descent who had come to Beaumont from New Orleans some years back and built a business that was the best-managed operation Clement had seen in 100 miles in any direction. Terence knew everyone who came through and most of what they were doing there, and he had a gift for remembering faces. "A woman named Abbott," Terence said thoughtfully, rubbing down a bay mare with a worn cloth. "Hazel Abbott, she's the one working for Hale." "That's her." "Good woman," Terence said. Fixed a calculation error in Hale's spring order that would have cost him $60. He didn't even know about it until she pointed it out. He glanced at Clement sideways. "Someone looking for her." "Might be," Clement said. "A man from Wichita Falls, big rancher type, wears his money loud, name of Gerald Price." Terence nodded slowly. "I'll watch for him. I'd appreciate it." "She a friend of yours?" Clement paused. "I'd like her to be," he said. Terence looked at him fully then, with the measuring expression of a man who was a fair judge of character. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded once and went back to the mare. Clement was in the Magnolia dining room at 6 o'clock. So was Hazel Abbott at the corner table with her ledger closed for once, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, and an expression on her face that was guarded but not closed. He crossed the room and stopped at her table. "May I?" he asked, nodding at the chair across from her. She studied him for a moment. "You may," she said. He sat down and Mrs. Drummond appeared with another cup of coffee and the look of a woman filing information away with the efficiency of a well-run card catalog. "How was your first full day?" Clement asked. "Mr. Hale's filing system is a creative fiction," Hazel said. "But there's order underneath the chaos, which is the important part. I've been untangling it." She paused. "I find I'm good at untangling things." "I believe it." The food arrived roast chicken this time, which was an improvement over yesterday, and they ate and talked, and it was one of those conversations that starts cautious and becomes gradually less so, the way rivers become wider and calmer as they move away from their source. She asked him how he'd gotten into tracking, and he told her honestly. He'd grown up in Arkansas, the youngest of 4 brothers on a small farm that couldn't sustain 4 sets of grown ambitions, and he'd drifted west at 19 with a good horse and a better eye, and had discovered that he had a natural facility for reading the land and the people moving across it, and had put that facility to work. She told him about herself in careful installments, like a person who has learned that information is currency and trades it thoughtfully. She'd grown up in Wichita Falls, the daughter of a schoolteacher father who died when she was 16 and a mother who died 2 years after that, leaving her with the house and a small inheritance that had been enough to keep her decent, but not enough to keep her independent for long. Gerald Price had come into her life when she was 22, presenting himself as a stable and respectable match, and she had been, she said with a self-aware wryness that he found both sad and admirable, sufficiently desperate for stability to mistake his performance of it for the real thing. "The first time he hit me," she said, in the same factual tone she'd used that morning, "I told myself it was the whiskey and it wouldn't happen again, which was the thing I'd been told women told themselves." "You left after the second time," Clement said. "I left after the second time," she confirmed. "I'd been planning it for 2 weeks before I actually went. I had money set aside, a route worked out, a destination in mind." She looked at her coffee cup. "I wanted to be somewhere he'd think was too far to chase. Somewhere I could use what I actually know, numbers, accounting, and build something that was actually mine." "You've made good progress in 3 weeks," Clement said. She looked up at him. "You tracked me in 3 weeks." "You left a decent trail," he said. "Better trackers would have found you sooner." He paused. "I visited the sheriff today, told him about Price, and the man at the livery will watch for anyone coming and asking questions about you." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know." Why did you? He met her eyes across the table. Because I made a judgment, he said, echoing his own words from that morning. And I've found that once I make a judgment like that, I tend to follow it all the way through. Something in her face shifted, something that had been held carefully in place for a long time relaxed, just slightly, like a fist unclenching, just slightly. Tell me something else about yourself, she said. Something that has nothing to do with tracking or Gerald Price. He thought about it. I make good coffee, he said. Better than most trail cooks and considerably better than the Magnolia Kitchen. I carry a small tin of decent beans and a proper grinder in my saddlebag, and I make it on a real small fire every morning on the trail. That seems like a strange thing to be particular about, she said, but her eyes had lightened. Most things worth being particular about seem strange to other people, he said. What about you? What do you do that has nothing to do with numbers or Gerald Price? She considered this, and then a smile came up, genuine and unhurried. I draw, she said. Plants mostly, wildflowers. I have a journal full of them. I started it when I was 12 and I've filled 3 since. He looked at her at the pencil still tucked in her hair, which he now understood had a second use beyond arithmetic, and felt something in his chest do that inconvenient thing again, only louder. They talked until Mrs. Drummond began making pointed gestures about the hour and the kitchen's need to close, and then they said their good nights at the foot of the stairs with a formality that felt both correct and faintly ridiculous given the intimacy of what they'd shared over dinner. Thank you for dinner, she said. I paid for myself, she added, which was accurate and necessary and which he hadn't been about to dispute. Good night, Miss Abbott, he said. Good night, Mr. Bishop, she said, and went upstairs. He stood in the lobby for a moment, and then he went outside and stood on the porch of the Magnolia and looked up at the Texas stars and thought that he was in a great deal of trouble and felt unreasonably pleased about it. The days settled into a rhythm after that, the particular kind of rhythm that forms when two cautious people are circling something they're not ready to name. Clement found work. He hadn't planned to stay long enough to need it, but he found himself disinclined to leave, and a man needed to pay for his room, so he made inquiries and found that a timber company operating north of Beaumont needed a surveyor and trail finder who could scout new routes for their logging operations. He knew the work. He'd done it before in the forests of East Texas, and the foreman, a taciturn man named Webb, hired him for $1.50 a day, which was honest pay. He rode out most mornings before 8 and was back in Beaumont by late afternoon, which gave him time to clean up and present himself at the Magnolia dining room by 6, where Hazel was generally already at her corner table with her ledger, or, increasingly, without it. They developed the kind of dinner table ease that is one of the more underrated forms of intimacy. They talked about everything and nothing, the particular quality of East Texas light in the evenings, which Hazel said was different from any other light she'd known. The timber foreman Webb's ability to communicate entire paragraphs of meaning through a single syllable. The political situation in Texas, which was complex and often dispiriting, with Reconstruction barely faded and tensions between various factions of the population still running livid. The question of what a person owed themselves versus what they owed the world, which they argued pleasantly over 2 separate dinners without resolving it. She showed him her plant drawings one evening, spreading the journal open on the table with the careful hands of a person presenting something precious. The drawings were extraordinarily fine and precise, with small written notes in the margins in her compact handwriting, identifying each specimen, noting where it grew, what season she'd found it. The kind of drawings that were half science and half love. These are remarkable, he said, and meant it with his whole chest. She looked pleased and uncertain simultaneously, the way people do when they've been told something true about themselves that they haven't quite made peace with. My father taught me the names, she said. He loved plants. He said knowing the name of a thing was the beginning of understanding it. He was right, Clement said. She closed the journal and folded her hands on top of it and said, What are you planning to do, Clement? He'd noticed the transition to first names about a week in. He couldn't remember who had gone first, which seemed right. In terms of what, he said. In terms of Beaumont, in terms of the timber company, in terms of whatever comes next. She looked at him directly. You're a man who moves. I can see it. You've been here 3 weeks, which I suspect is longer than you usually stay anywhere. Probably is, he said. I'm not asking you to stay, she said carefully. I wouldn't ask that. I don't have any claim on your plans. But you're asking what they are, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, considering. I'm finding that what comes next is less clear to me than it usually is, he said honestly. I'm used to knowing where I'm going. I generally have a direction. Right now I don't have one. Because of the job you gave up, she asked. Not the job, he said quietly. She looked at him. Something passed between them again, that current that had been running under every conversation and every shared meal. That thing that neither of them had named yet, because naming it was a significant action and they were both people who took significant action seriously. Clement, she said, and his name in her mouth sounded like something new. I want you to know what you did, returning that money, riding back. That wasn't nothing to me. I know, he said. I don't trust easily, she said. I think you've probably gathered that. I have. I trust you, she said. I want you to know that. I haven't said it to many people in my life and meant it the way I mean it now. He reached across the table slowly and laid his hand over hers where it rested on the journal cover. She looked down at their hands and then up at him, and neither of them moved for a moment. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Not yet. And when I do, if I do, I won't go quietly. She turned her hand over under his and wrapped her fingers around his and held on, not with desperation but with deliberateness, which was entirely her. The trouble came on a Thursday, as trouble often does, unexpectedly on an otherwise unremarkable day. Clement was coming back from the timber survey at the usual time, riding down the main street on Biscuit with the pleasant tiredness of a man who had done honest work in open air, when he saw Terence Bovise coming toward him on foot with a look on his face that converted tiredness quickly into alertness. Man came in this morning, Terence said without preamble. Big fellow, well-dressed, asking questions about a woman. Clement stopped Biscuit. Price himself. Not Price, different name. Roper, he said, but he matched your description of the type, money loud, manner rougher than the clothes. Terence looked at him steadily. He's at the 2-bit. Clement dismounted. Is she still at Hale's? She's there. I went by 20 minutes ago. She's there. Did he go to Hale's? Not yet. He was asking at the hotel first and Mrs. Drummond gave him nothing. Clement handed Biscuit's reins to Terence without being asked. I'll go to Hale's first, he said. He walked to the feed and grain with a measured stride, not running because running attracted attention, and pushed through the door. Hazel was at the counter with Mr. Hale, an elderly man with a white beard and a gentle disposition, going over a supply list. She looked up when Clement came in and read his face immediately. Mr. Hale, she said with remarkable composure, would you excuse me for a moment? Mr. Hale looked between them with the mild confusion of a kind man confronted with something outside his experience, and nodded and retreated to the back. Someone's here, Hazel said to Clement quietly. Man named Roper, probably sent by Price. He's at the 2-bit asking around. She was quiet for 5 seconds, which was exactly how long it took her to think it through. What are my options? You could leave town, he said. I hate saying it because you've built something here, but I'm not leaving, she said, and the flatness of it was final. I left once because I had to. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life leaving when men decide to come after me. He looked at her, this woman who had run 200 miles not from cowardice but from practical necessity, who had rebuilt her life in 3 weeks from nothing, who drew wildflowers in a journal and untangled creative fiction filing systems and trusted carefully and meant it entirely, and something settled in him the way a stone settles into good ground. All right, he said. Then we handle it here. What does that look like? She said. It looks like going to Sheriff Cole, he said, together right now. They went together to Sheriff Cole's office, which was a small adobe building on the side street behind the main, and Hazel told the sheriff directly, and without embellishment what she had told Clement about Gerald Price, the betrothal, the violence, the departure. She was calm and precise about it, which Clement suspected was because she had rehearsed being calm and precise, because she knew that women who were emotional were less believed. Sheriff Cole listened with his gray mustache still and his hands flat on his desk and his eyes, for all their patience, going a degree harder as she spoke. "You're saying Price sent this man to bring you back," he said. "That's what I believe," she said. "Someone named Bishop was hired first. He returned the money and didn't complete the job." She glanced at Clement. "Then this man Roper arrived." Cole looked at Clement. "You're Bishop." "I am." "You tracked her here and turned down the job." "Mailed the money back before I spoke to her," Clement said. "Sent a letter saying the work was declined. Price knows I'm out of it." Cole nodded slowly. "So this Roper is a second attempt." He stood up. "I'll go find him." What followed was one of the less dramatic but more satisfying scenes Clement had ever witnessed. Sheriff Cole found the man named Roper at the two-bit, exactly where Terrence had said he would be, working on his second whiskey and inquiring of the barman about women traveling alone. Cole sat down across from him and had a very quiet conversation, at the end of which Roper left his drink and rode out of Beaumont within the hour. Clement heard about it from Terrence that evening. He went to find Hazel to tell her, and found her outside the Magnolia on the small porch, sitting in one of the wooden chairs with her journal open on her knees and her pencil moving, drawing something he couldn't see from the steps. She looked up when she heard him, and he saw the question in her eyes, and he said, "He's gone," and watched her breathe. She looked back at her journal. "Come look at this," she said. He came and sat in the chair beside her and looked at the page, and she had been drawing a wildflower, a small one, with fine petals and a complex center, and around it she had written in that compact handwriting a word he hadn't expected. "Courageweed," he said aloud, reading it, because that was what it said. "That's what the Cherokee call it," she said. "My father told me. It means the plant that grows where others can't. Difficult soil, poor light." She looked at the drawing. "I found it this morning on the way to work, growing in a crack between the front steps of the general store." He looked at her, and she was not looking at him. She was looking at the drawing, but there was something in the set of her shoulders that was open in a way he hadn't seen before, something laid down, some weight she'd been carrying since before he met her, or maybe since before she'd left Wichita Falls, or maybe longer. "Hazel," he said. She looked at him. "I'd like to stay in Beaumont," he said. "Not because of Price or Roper or any of that. Because of you. Because I would like to find out what this is between us, if you're willing to find out with me." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "I've been trying not to let myself want that." "Why?" "Because wanting things has gone wrong for me before." "I know," he said. "I know it has, but I'm not Price, Hazel, and you're not the woman who made that choice 3 years ago. You're a woman who drove 200 miles by herself and built something in 3 weeks and told a man who came to bring her back that she wasn't leaving." She was quiet. "You're courageweed," he said. "You grow where others can't." Something in her face went very soft, and then she laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, short and bright, and said, "That's either the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me or the strangest, and I genuinely cannot decide which." "Both, probably," he said. She looked at him with those straight brown eyes and said, "Stay, then, find out what it is." The summer of 1878 was hot and green, and full of the particular kind of joy that comes when two careful people decide, finally, to be less careful. It moved slowly, and it moved right. There were evening walks along the river, where the cypresses leaned over the water, and the fireflies came out in their hundreds at dusk, and they talked without running out of things to say. There were afternoons where Clement met Hazel after her work at Hale's, and they rode out on Biscuit together. She rode behind him with her arms around his waist and her chin on his shoulder, pointing out wildflowers on the roadside with the pencil she always kept tucked in her hair. And those afternoons felt like something from a life he hadn't known he was supposed to have. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday in June, standing at the river's edge in the late light with her journal under her arm and the fireflies beginning, and it was not dramatic or sudden. It was the natural conclusion of a sentence that had been starting for weeks, and when it was done, she pressed her forehead briefly to his jaw, and he put his arms around her, and they stood like that with the river running past and the evening coming on. And it was the quietest and most complete thing he had ever felt. She said against his collar, "I was afraid of this, of being kissed, of wanting to be," she said, "of wanting anything this much." He held her more firmly. "I know," he said. "Me too." She pulled back and looked at him. "You were afraid. I'm usually a man who knows exactly what he's doing and where he's going," he said. "I've been neither of those things since I walked into the Magnolia dining room and saw you with that ledger." She cupped his face in her hand briefly. "The way you touch something you're confirming is real." And then she smiled at him, that full, unhurried smile, and said, "Good. I'd hate to be the only one in a state." He laughed. She liked it when he laughed. She'd told him so. Not everything was easy. Hazel had walls that she'd built for good reasons, and occasionally she retreated behind them without warning, going quiet and distant in a way that he'd learned early not to press against, but simply to wait out, to stay present and patient until she came back. She always came back, and when she did, she always acknowledged it. "I went somewhere dark," she said one evening after one of those silences, sitting on the Magnolia porch in the summer night. "I do that sometimes. I'm sorry." "Don't apologize for it," he said. "I'm not apologizing for the darkness," she said. "I'm apologizing for disappearing on you. That's different." He looked at her. "Then thank you for coming back." "Always," she said, simply and with weight. The matter of Gerald Price was not entirely finished. In late June, a letter arrived at the Beaumont post office addressed to Hazel Abbott, the first piece of mail she'd received under her own name since arriving, which meant Price had tracked her location if not her person. The letter was brief and contained the kind of language that dressed itself as concern and love while meaning control and ownership. It spoke of worry and heartbreak, and the suggestion that she had been confused, and that everything could be as it was if she would simply come home. Hazel read the letter at the dinner table with Clement beside her, and her face did not change much while she read, but her hands went very still, and when she finished, she set it down flat on the table and looked at it for a moment. "He knows where I am," she said. "The return address on the money I sent him would have been Quincy," Clement said. "Close enough to put him in this area. He might have hired someone else to narrow it down." "What do I do?" she said. "You could not respond," he said. "That's one option. He'll keep writing," she said, "possibly, or he'll take it as a rejection and move on." She looked at him. "Do you think he'll move on?" He was honest. "I think men like him have trouble with rejection," he said. "But I also think there are limits to what he'll do when there's no legal claim. You weren't married. You were betrothed. An engagement can be broken. It's not common, but it's not against the law." She nodded, thinking. Then she picked up the letter, folded it, and handed it to him. "I want to write a response," she said. "Will you help me?" They wrote it together that evening, Hazel's words, Clement's occasional suggestions about clarity and firmness. The letter was not cruel, but it was unmistakable. It said that she had made her decision freely and with full understanding of its consequences. It said that she wished Mr. Price well but would not be returning. It said that she was under no legal obligation to him, that she had the support of local law enforcement, and that further correspondence would not receive a reply. It was signed Hazel Abbott. She read it back to herself and said, "Is it too much?" "It's exactly right," he said. She sealed it herself and posted it herself the next morning, and then she went to work at the feed and grain, and she did not hear from Gerald Price again. That silence, when it held through July and into August, was its own kind of answered prayer. Clement extended his work with the timber company through the summer and into fall, and began to develop a secondary reputation in Beaumont as a man who could find lost cattle and occasionally lost people, working exclusively on jobs he approved of, which turned out to be a distinction that people respected. He built relationships in the town with Terrence at the livery, with Sheriff Cole, with the minister of the small church on Elm Street who turned out to be a man of remarkable good sense, with a network of people who made a place feel like somewhere rather than just somewhere you happen to be. Hazel was promoted by Mr. Hale from occasional bookkeeping to full-time management of his accounts. And then, when word got around that she had identified and corrected multiple significant errors in his books, other businesses began to approach her. By fall, she had 3 clients in addition to Hale, and she was working out of a small rented office space above the general store, her own space, with her own sign on the door that said H. Abbott, Accounts and Records, and a desk she'd bought second-hand and refinished herself, and a shelf for her plant journals. He went to see it the day she moved in, helping her carry the desk up the narrow stairs with the particular comedy of 2 people with strong opinions trying to maneuver a piece of furniture through a doorway. When it was in and set right, and the journals were on the shelf and the ink and pens arranged on the desk, she stood in the middle of the small room and looked around with the expression of a person who has arrived somewhere they intended to be. "Mine," she said quietly. He looked at her from the doorway and felt his whole chest fill up with something that was not a small or manageable feeling. "Hazel," he said. She turned. "I love you," he said. "I want you to know that. I'm not saying it to rush anything or to change anything about what we're doing. I'm saying it because it's been true for a while and it seemed dishonest to keep not saying it." She looked at him for a moment with that full, steady gaze, and then she crossed the room and put her arms around him and held on, and he folded his arms around her and felt her breathe. "I love you too," she said, into his chest, where he could feel the words as much as hear them. "I've been trying to figure out when to say it. I kept waiting for the right moment." "There's never a right moment," he said. "There's just this one." She pulled back and looked up at him, and then she kissed him in the middle of her small office above the general store in Beaumont, Texas, with the afternoon light coming through the window and the sound of the town going about its life below. And it was a real and complete thing, the kind that doesn't require a particular setting to be significant. Autumn came in gold and rust, and a cooling that was welcome after the long heat. They had settled into something that felt, in the best way, domestic and real, walking together in the mornings, sharing meals, spending Sundays after church, both of them having taken it up more consistently, finding the small community of it pleasant rather than obligatory, at the river or riding out into the countryside with Hazel's journal and Clement's particular talent for stillness, both of them comfortable in the shared silence that is the most reliable sign of genuine intimacy. He proposed to her in October, in the way that felt most like him, directly and without theater, though not without feeling. They were sitting on a fallen log at the river's edge on a Sunday afternoon, the cypresses gone bronze above the water, and he said, "I've been thinking about something." "You've been thinking about something all afternoon," she said, which was accurate. She was better at reading him than anyone ever had been, which he found not alarming but restful. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to be married to you for the rest of my life. I want to build something with you, not something temporary or situational, but something permanent, if that's something you want." She was very quiet. He waited because he had learned that her silences were working silences and interrupting them was not useful. "I was afraid of marrying someone once before," she said finally. "For good reason, as it turned out." "I know. I'm not afraid of marrying you," she said. "I want you to know that. I've thought about it. I've thought about what I feared and why, and I've thought about who you are, and I'm not afraid of this." "Then you'll marry me." She turned to look at him, and there was something in her face that was completely open, completely without guard, a thing he had learned to treasure, knowing what it cost her. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you, Clement Bishop." He had a ring. He'd bought it from a jeweler in a town 40 miles away, a simple gold band with a small garnet set into it, garnet for the color of Texas earth and autumn leaves, which made sense to him in a way that diamonds did not. She held out her hand and he put it on her finger, and she looked at it for a long moment and then up at him, and her eyes were bright. "It's beautiful," she said. "It reminded me of autumn," he said. It reminded me of you." She pulled him to her by the lapels of his jacket and kissed him soundly. And the river ran past them, and the afternoon light shifted golden through the bronze leaves. And they were, both of them, extraordinarily happy. They were married in December of 1878 in the small church on Elm Street, with the minister who had good sense presiding and most of Beaumont in attendance, because by this point both Clement and Hazel had become people the town knew and valued. Terence Bovey sat in the front row with his wife, a beautiful and formidably intelligent woman named Marie who had taken Hazel under her wing almost from the beginning. Mr. Hale was there, beaming under his white beard. Sheriff Cole was there, which Hazel found touching. The sawmill workers who Clement had become friendly with during the timber survey were there in their good shirts, slightly uncomfortable in the church but earnest about it. Hazel wore a dress of deep burgundy, not white, which she had discussed with Clement, and he had simply said, whatever she wanted was right, with her hair done up with fresh flowers woven through it by Marie. And she walked down the aisle alone because she had no father to walk with her, but she walked without hesitation. And when she reached him at the altar and looked up at him, she was smiling so fully that he felt it like warmth. He said his vows clearly and deliberately, the way he did everything, and meant every word of them. She said hers looking directly at him, in the clear and unembellished way that was entirely her, and her voice did not shake. When the minister said they were married, there was a cheer from the sawmill workers that startled the minister but made Hazel laugh, and Clement kissed his wife in the December afternoon light in the small Beaumont church, and felt himself become a man who was, without reservation, where he was supposed to be. The winter was good. They moved out of the Magnolia. They'd kept their respective rooms through the autumn out of a combination of practicality and respect for the formality that the town expected, and into a rented house on the north side of Beaumont, a small but solid structure with a proper kitchen, and a room that became Hazel's office, and a bedroom with a window that looked east, so the morning light came in. They learned each other in the way that only living together teaches, the smaller rhythms, the habits, the particular irritations and delights that don't show up on walks and dinners. He learned that she was a morning person and fierce about coffee, that she made a small decisive sound when she solved a problem, that she talked to herself when working through difficult accounts, that she was better at forgiving people who had wronged her than forgiving herself for things she considered mistakes. She learned that he was meticulous about his equipment and his horse to the point of ritual, that he went quiet and still when he was troubled, and needed to be offered space rather than questions, that he made an extraordinary breakfast when given the opportunity and was, about that particular skill, almost shy. They had arguments occasionally, because they were both people with convictions and neither of them had the inclination to fold. The arguments were about real things, money, direction, the degree to which Clement's work sometimes took him away for days at a time, and what that meant for both of them. And they resolved them with the directness that came naturally to both, sometimes heatedly but always thoroughly, never leaving anything half-finished between them. It was one of those arguments that produced the most important conversation they'd had since the one in the back of the feed, and grained the morning after he'd returned from Quincy. In the spring of 1879, Clement came back from a 4-day tracking job, a rancher's stolen cattle, recovered successfully, everyone paid, to find Hazel at the kitchen table with a ledger closed in front of her and a stillness about her that he had learned to read. "What happened?" he said, hanging his hat on the hook inside the door. "Nothing happened," she said. "I've been thinking." He sat down across from her. "Tell me." She looked at him with those steady eyes. "The work I'm doing is good," she said. "I have 6 clients now. I'm making real money. I have an office that is mine." She paused. "And I want more. More clients, more everything," she said. "I want to take the bookkeeping and accounting work and make it bigger, not just small businesses in Beaumont. There are bigger operations in this region, the timber companies, the ranching concerns that need proper accounting and don't have it. I could provide that, But I'd need to travel sometimes. I'd need to go to them. He looked at her. So do it, he said. She looked at him. You travel for your work, she said. I've found that difficult. I know. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm saying I know what it feels like for the other person, and I want to be honest about the fact that I'm proposing doing the same thing to you. He leaned his elbows on the table. Hazel, he said. You know what your father's death and your mother's death and Gerald Price did to you. It made you afraid to want things for yourself. It made you feel like your wanting was a danger to other people. She was quiet. What you just described is a good idea, he said. A smart idea. It plays to exactly what you're best at, and you're best at it in a way that's exceptional. The discomfort of you traveling for it is mine to manage, and I am telling you I can manage it. She looked at him for a long moment. You're sure? I'm sure, he said. I'd rather be here worrying about you for 3 days than spend the rest of our lives watching you make yourself smaller. She reached across the table and took his hand. I love you, she said. I know, he said. Build the bigger thing. She did. By the fall of 1879, Hazel Bishop, she had taken his name with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has chosen to give something freely, was managing accounts for 4 of the major timber operations in the region, a ranching concern outside of Beaumont that employed 40 men, and 3 smaller businesses in town. She had hired a young woman named Clara Marsh to manage her Beaumont clients while she was away, and Clara turned out to be both capable and grateful and grew under Hazel's guidance with the speed of something that had been waiting for the right soil. Clement had built his own practice into something more stable and selective, less cattle recovery, which he found wearing on the soul, more land surveying and trail finding for the growing infrastructure needs of the region, which suited him better and paid equivalently. He'd bought Biscuit outright from the circumstances of borrowing. The roan had technically belonged to a rental concern in Wichita Falls, a detail he'd resolved with appropriate payment shortly after arriving in Beaumont. And he had also acquired a second horse, a gray mare called Frost, smart and calm, who Hazel rode when they went out together. They went out most Sundays when neither of them was traveling, taking the horses down the river roads or out into the countryside, Hazel with her journal and Clement with whatever quiet he needed from the week. And those Sundays accumulated into something precious, a catalog of seasons and places, and the particular quality of light at different hours on different days, all of it held in the journals that continued to fill up on the shelf above Hazel's desk. In the winter of 1879, Hazel told him she was expecting their first child. She told him at breakfast on a Tuesday, with the same directness she brought to every important thing, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with her coffee cup held in both hands and her eyes calm and watchful. He put his fork down. When? He said. August, I think, she said. I'm not entirely certain. I'm going to see Dr. Whitfield. He looked at her for a moment, and then he got up from his chair and came around the table and knelt beside hers and took her face in both hands. She put her hands over his and looked at him. Are you all right? He said. I'm wonderful, she said simply. I didn't know I would be. I wasn't sure how I'd feel, but I'm wonderful. Eyes had gone bright. She reached up and wiped his cheek with her thumb. We're going to be good at this, she said, both of us. How do you know? He said. Because we're good at everything we try, she said, when we try it together. He laughed and pulled her into him and held her carefully, which made her laugh too and tell him he didn't have to hold her carefully. She wasn't glass, and he said he knew that. She was the furthest thing from glass he'd ever encountered, and she laughed again, and it was fine. Dr. Whitfield confirmed what she already knew, and she was careful and sensible about the pregnancy in the way she was careful and sensible about everything, working through most of it, traveling a little less in the later months, reading the books available to her on the subject with scholarly thoroughness, discussing with Marie Beauvais, who had 2 children of her own, and was a reliable and unsentimental source of practical advice. Clement was, Hazel would tell Marie with a fondness that was only slightly exasperated, wonderful and occasionally ridiculous about the whole thing. He had strong opinions about which roads were too rough to travel by wagon and came home with books and remedies, and a particular nutritious broth recipe he'd gotten from the cook at a logging camp with entirely too much confidence in its properties. He brought me a broth made of God knows what, Hazel told Marie one afternoon in the spring, and Marie said, with the world weariness of a woman who had been through this exact dynamic, "They need something to do. Let him make the broth." In August of 1880, they had a son. The labor was long, and Clement spent most of it in a state of controlled agony in the sitting room while Dr. Whitfield and Marie managed matters with competence and calm, and when Whitfield finally came out and said mother and child were both well, Clement sat down hard on the settee and put his face in his hands, and was not ashamed of the sound he made. He was brought in a few minutes later to find Hazel in the bed with a small, red, furious person in the crook of her arm, and she looked up at him with the exhausted and absolute triumph of a woman who has accomplished something enormous. "Come look at him," she said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son's dark hair, which he apparently got from Clement's clenched fists, the wrinkled, ferocious face of someone newly arrived from somewhere difficult, and felt a love so immediate and physical it was nearly painful. "What do we call him?" he said. They had talked about names. They'd arrived at a short list without settling. "James," she said. "After my father." She looked at him. "James Clement Bishop, if you agree." He put his hand gently against the side of his son's head. "James Clement Bishop," he said. "Yes." James Clement Bishop was, from the very beginning, a person with opinions and volume, and he made both known with a commitment that his parents found simultaneously exhausting and admirable. He was dark-haired and bright-eyed, and by the time he was walking, he had his father's quality of still, watchful attention, and his mother's decisive way of moving when he'd made up his mind about something. The years after James's birth were the kind of years that build the substance of a life, not dramatic in the way that the first years had been, but full in a way that made the drama seem like it was just the necessary clearing of ground before the planting. Hazel's accounting practice grew into something that would not have looked out of place in any city. By 1882, she was employing Clara Marsh full-time, and had taken on a second associate, a young man from Nacogdoches named Albert, who was meticulous and quiet, and became devoted to the work with the fervor of someone who has found their correct purpose. She was known in the timber and ranching communities of East Texas as the woman who understood numbers the way some people understood land, intuitively, completely, with a respect for their complexity that prevented the simple errors that had cost other people significant amounts of money. Clement had settled into a practice that was primarily land surveying for the expanding settlements and infrastructure of the region, with occasional tracking work for law enforcement rather than private hire. He developed a policy against private hire after Price, and the policy had served him well. He worked with Sheriff Cole on two significant cases in 1881, a cattle theft ring that had been operating in 3 counties, and the recovery of a missing child from a difficult situation involving a custody dispute, and both resolutions left him with the quiet satisfaction of having used his skills for something he could stand behind entirely. They bought land in 1882, 5 acres north of Beaumont, with a creek running along the eastern edge, and they built a house on it over the course of a year, not all at once, but steadily, with Clement doing a significant amount of the work himself and hiring local men for what was beyond his skill. Hazel chose the particulars of it with the focused attention she brought to everything: where the windows went, how the kitchen was laid out, the porch that ran along the south side for the afternoon shade, the room off the kitchen that became her office, the extra bedroom for James and potentially for whoever came after James. They moved in the fall of 1883, and it felt, in the way that the right things do, like arriving. James, who was 3 by then, immediately fell into the creek on the second day, and Clement fished him out while Hazel stood on the bank and said, in a tone balanced exactly between alarm and inevitability. "I knew that would happen." And James, soaked and cheerful, said something about fish that was not quite articulate but entirely clear in intent. They had a daughter in the spring of 1884. She arrived more quickly than James had, and more emphatically, the kind of baby who communicates from the first moment that she has things to say and intends to say them. She had Hazel's brown eyes and Clement's dark hair and an expression of acute assessment that she wore from infancy with remarkable dignity. "Aliner," Hazel said when Clement came in and found them. "Aliner," he said, looking at his daughter who looked back at him with those old, wise eyes. "Aliner Bishop." "She already looks like she's decided something," he said. "Good," Hazel said. "She should." Clement sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his family. His wife who had driven 200 miles and built something from nothing. His 3-year-old son who fell into creeks with enthusiasm. His newborn daughter who had opinions about her own arrival, and felt the particular completeness of a man who has more than he knew to want. When Alina was 2 months old and James was 3.5 and Hazel was returned to her desk, in the office off the kitchen with the energy of a woman who needs to work the way some people need to breathe. Clement took an afternoon off and rode Biscuit Old now, grayer around the muzzle, but steady as ever down to the river road they had ridden so many times in the early days. He sat by the water and looked at the cypresses, older and taller than they'd been when he first saw them, and thought about the man he'd been when he rode into Beaumont with $50 silver and a name on a piece of paper. He thought about Gerald Price, who had sent his money back and done what people like him generally do, found another way to manage the disappointment, and moved on to whatever came next. Clement hadn't heard his name in 5 years. He thought about the man named Roper who had ridden out of Beaumont at Sheriff Cole's quiet insistence and never returned. He thought about the letter Hazel had sent, sealed in her own hand, and the silence that had followed it. He thought about Terence Bovise, who had become one of his closest friends, whose children played with James and would play with Alina, who had come to the wedding in his good coat, and who had been one of the men who helped build the north wall of the new house. He thought about Mrs. Drummond at the Magnolia, who had given Price's man nothing, and had come to Hazel and Clement's wedding with a gift of fine linen. He thought about a woman in a corner of a hotel dining room with a ledger open and a pencil in her hair, and how he had looked at her and thought, "The plan does not survive the finding." He was right about that, just not in the way he'd feared at the time. He rode back to the house in the late afternoon, and coming up the drive he could see Hazel on the south porch, the porch she had designed for the afternoon shade, sitting with Alina asleep against her shoulder, and a ledger balanced on her knee, pencil in her hair, writing something. The light was that East Texas autumn gold, and she was completely absorbed and completely herself, and Clement brought Biscuit to a stop at the gate just to look for a moment. She looked up with the instinct she had always had for knowing when he was there. "The cattle assessment took less time than you thought," she said. "I finished early," he said. "Where's James?" "Marie's," she said. "Until supper." She shifted Alina gently. "Come sit with me." He stabled Biscuit and came and sat beside her on the porch, and Alina slept on, a warm and solid weight between them, and Hazel put her pencil in her hair beside the other one. She sometimes put 2 up there when she was in the middle of something and leaned her head against his shoulder. "I've been thinking," she said, which were words that always got his attention. "Tell me," he said. "I want to expand what Clara's doing," she said. "Give her a real partnership in the practice. Make her a full partner. She's ready, and it would free me up to take on the larger consulting work. The railroad concerns are starting to come into this part of Texas, and they're going to need someone who can manage the accounting for something that size, and I'd like it to be us." He nodded. "What does that require?" "Money," she said, "and time and trust in Clara, which I have." She looked at him. "And your opinion, because I trust that too." "Clara's more than ready," he said. "And the railroads coming in means this region is about to change faster than it has in 10 years. Being in position when that happens is smart. Do it." She was quiet for a moment, then said, I love you. I love you, he said. Alina made a small sound in her sleep and tightened her small fist in the fabric of Hazel's dress, and they both looked at her for a moment with the particular tenderness that is reserved for sleeping children and very few other things. We should get James before supper, Hazel said. We have time, Clement said. Stay here a little longer. She settled back against his shoulder. Tell me something, she said. Something that has nothing to do with work or children or anything practical. I'm still better at coffee than the Magnolia Kitchen, he said. She laughed that full, bright laugh, and it went out into the autumn afternoon, and he felt it in his chest the way he always did, which was entirely. That is completely true, she said. They sat on the porch in the late light with their daughter sleeping between them and the creek murmuring somewhere behind the house, and the trees going gold and rust in the early October air. And the life they had built together settled around them like good land, solid, particular, shaped by real work and real choices, growing in the directions they had chosen together. What had begun with $50 silver and a name on a piece of paper had become, through the particular alchemy of a man who made a judgment and a woman who had driven 200 miles to claim her own life, something that neither of them had known they were going toward until they were in it. Something that looked like courage weed on a winter morning, growing where others couldn't, in the difficult soil between what life does to you and what you make of it after. Clement Bishop had been paid to bring Hazel Abbott back to the man she'd fled. He had returned the money before he reached her door. He had ridden back to Beaumont on the strength of a feeling he couldn't name, and she had looked at him over empty glass jars behind a feed and grain with the eyes of a woman deciding whether to trust the world one more time. She had decided yes. So had he. And on a south-facing porch in East Texas in the autumn of 1884, with a sleeping baby and 2 pencils in her hair and a ledger that could wait until tomorrow, that decision had accumulated into something that was, by any honest measure, exactly what a life was supposed to be. James came home from the Beauvaises just before sunset, running up the drive with the absolute conviction of a 4-year-old who has somewhere urgent to be, and they heard him before they saw him. He came bursting around the corner of the house and up the porch steps and stopped when he saw them, arrested mid-momentum by the sleeping baby and the particular quality of the afternoon stillness. "Mama," he said, quieter now, because he had learned quickly about the sleeping baby. "Hello, love," Hazel said. "Mrs. Bovy said her chickens escaped again," he said with enormous importance. "Did they catch them?" Clement asked. "Some of them," James said, deeply uncertain. "There were a lot of chickens." "There always are," Clement said. James climbed onto the porch bench on Clement's other side and leaned against him with the easy weight of a child utterly comfortable in his place, and looked at Alina sleeping on his mother with the proprietorial assessment of an older sibling. "She's small," he said. "She was small when you were her age too," Hazel said. "I wasn't small," James said, with complete conviction. Clement looked at Hazel over the top of James's head, and she was already looking at him with that full smile, the real one, the one that came from all the way down, and he felt it the way he always did, like warmth, like the river, like the East Texas light in October coming gold through the cypress trees. Outside, the afternoon wound down into evening. The creek spoke softly along the eastern edge of their land. Alina slept on. James, reassured that the chicken's situation had been adequately reported and assessed, began to drowse against Clement's shoulder. The sky went from gold to rose to the deep, particular purple of a Texas evening, and the first stars appeared, sharp and clean above the tree line. Hazel reached across James's drowsing head and took Clement's hand, and he held it, and they sat together in the gathering dark of everything they had made, and it was, without question, enough. More than enough. It was the thing itself.